Wingardium transphobia, Paterficus totalis, sectum semper gender critalicus. Okay, so maybe not every single Harry Potter spell is useful as a transphobia pun, but come on, at least I'm trying. Anywho, as should be obvious, as I have a kind of creepy photo of her kind of hanging over my shoulder here, I'm yet again making a video on JK Rowling, the author who just keeps on giving despite everyone trying their damnedest to just say, please stop. And we're talking about her today because Rowling is yet again placing herself into the public discourse, specifically surrounding trans people.
This time surrounding an incident where 3 trans activists allegedly doxed JK Rowling at her home in Edinburgh, Scotland.
And of course, this has gotten very heated, rightfully so, given that this is surrounding issues of doxing, harassment, and all of that stuff, as well as the context of JK Rowling having continually allied herself with TERFs, or trans-exclusionary radical feminists, sometimes known as gender-critical feminists. As probably most of you watching this video know, I have done many videos on TERFs, gender-critical feminists, JK Rowling herself, and in all of those videos, I've tried as best I can be to be as calm, level-headed, and empathetic as I can be to the whole situation. You know what I mean? Look at any of my other videos I've done on TERFs and JK Rowling, and I hope it shows how much I at least have tried to be one of the least hyperbolic voices as I can be, while also trying to be clear about recognizing the harm being caused by the dogmatic hate group that is gender-critical feminism, aka TERFs, that JK Rowling has consistently supported, that directly targets the trans community that I'm a part of, and that, more importantly, I care so much about, particularly those who are much more vulnerable than I am, given that I live in a fairly trans-affirming city, at least as trans-affirming as it can be in the United States, and also am, fairly privileged in a lot of my background. But at the very least, I try my best to be as welcoming to people who may be new to this issue and new to discussions on JK Rowling, gender-critical feminism, TERFs, and trans issues and all that stuff by at least trying to start off coming from a place of, let's just try to understand the issue. However, this particular incident, I can't do that because, to be honest, I am very upset about this particular one because not only is it the latest in a slew of incidents surrounding gender-critical feminists and JK Rowling specifically, but it also encapsulates so much of the malicious narratives that have been created and wielded to vilify trans people, as well as indicative of so much more that we'll be talking about in just a second. So, with that being said, I'm going to break this incident down for you, again, trying to be as calm and just lay out the facts as I can be, but just know that this is where I'm coming from. But to be clear about my intent here, even within that, as always, I'm not here to attack JK Rowling. Believe me, I don't enjoy making these videos about JK Rowling. I don't have an active desire to tear her down because I'm a trans person or because it's, good for the internet algorithm or anything like that. My goal here, as always, is to educate. Because I do believe that this situation is emblematic of the kind of misinformation and especially the double standard wielded against the trans community in order to paint us as malicious or hateful or actively villainous. So I hope that this video can come across as an explainer to those of you who may be coming into this discussion on the side of thinking of how horrible it was that JK Rowling was doxxed by trans people and may be angry at the trans community because of that, how there is much more nuance to this situation than that. Though, also within that, I will say on a personal, I do have a little bit of a secret reason for making this video, a sort of trans agenda, if you will, a transgender. See what I did there? It's probably dumb. That's a dumb joke. Anyways, I'll talk about that specific reasoning towards the end of this video. It's a little ancillary to this, but we'll get to it towards the end, so stick around for that.
On Friday, November 19th, 3 trans activists who are not transgender themselves protested outside of JK Rowling's Edinburgh, Scotland mansion.
One of several houses that she owns, it should be noted. During their protest, they took this photo and posted it online, with JK Rowling's address, which has been cropped out of this version of the photo, clearly in view. Several days after this, JK Rowling posted on Twitter a response to the photo with this statement. Last Friday, my family's address was posted on Twitter by 3 activist actors who took pictures of themselves in front of our house, carefully positioning themselves to ensure that our address was visible. I want to say a massive thank you to everybody who reported the image to @TwitterSupport. Your kindness and decency made all the difference to my family and me. me. I'd also like to thank @Police Scotland for their support and assistance in this matter. I implore those people who retweeted the image with the address still visible, even if they did so in condemnation of these people's actions, to delete it. Now, there's much more to her statement, but we'll get to that in just a little bit. But basically, JK Rowling argued that she was doxed, which basically means someone posting your address online with the intent to both make you feel unsafe at your own home and possibly direct harassment and worse towards you. Doxing is a criminal offense, and JK Rowling did state that she had been in contact with the Scottish police after this incident. So there's a lot to talk about with this, and I'll start with the most obvious and most necessary to say up front. If it was the overt intent of these trans activists to dox JK Rowling, that is of course horrible, and I denounce it. Doxing is an absolutely horrible thing. It is very, very scary. I know from personal experience. I have been doxed. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. And so, if that was the intention of these trans activists, if that was something that JK Rowling felt as well, I totally understand that, and that is absolutely horrible, and I do denounce that. That being said, though, we'll get to the intentions of these trans activists, and if it was their intent to dox her in just a minute. But this brings me to my next discussion. You see, JK Rowling's home address, the one that's in that photo, is already fairly known public knowledge. Literally a 30-second Google search can tell you where to find that address, even before this entire incident. And even further, JK Rowling's home is actually promoted as part of Edinburgh's tourist page as a place to visit. It's not as if it's a big secret. I mean, being honest with all of you, I know this from personal experience. You want to know why? Because I've been to JK Rowling's mansion. Back in 2013, I visited Edinburgh for the Fringe Theatre Festival there, and I took a bus tour while there, and literally, the tour guide, in between him pointing out Game of Thrones filming locations and his horrible yet wonderful pun-related humor that only a 40-year-old tour guide could deliver so beautifully perfectly, he pointed over and said, "And on your left is the home of JK Rowling, author of Harry Potter and future revealer of how wizards poop." Okay, so he didn't say that last part, but JK Rowling's home was part of the bus tour. And I, being a young pre-out trans woman who still looked up to Rowling at the time and was problematically ignoring that Gringotts goblins were clearly evoking Jewish stereotypes, went,
"Ah, a person who writes books lives there. A person who writes books that I like."
I'm gonna come out as trans just to spite her.
Even then, I knew the trans agenda. All these jokes aside, point is, JK Rowling's home is publicly known. It's not like there's a secret keeper that these trans activists hunted down in order to learn her address, nor was there posting of the photo showcasing some secret knowledge to the world. Even further, going to protest outside JK Rowling's home is not exactly unwarranted. The reason these trans women protested is due to Rowling's consistent and outspoken support of the gender-critical movement in the United Kingdom. For those of you who don't know, as I alluded to earlier, gender-critical feminists are a dogmatic hate campaign against the transgender community, a movement made up of many different groups but united by a specific ideology that wields misinformation in order to push anti-transgender legislation and disinformation campaigns about the trans community. I've done a whole video on the ideology of TERFs and the issues with it, as well as another video on the dangerous direct harm TERFs have caused both in the United States and the UK, to not only trans folks, but to women's rights, LGBTQ rights, as well as their support of more totalitarian and fascist policies. But to give you a short, brief list of recent examples of their harm, TERFs have both in the US and UK worked to deny trans-affirming healthcare for trans kids, led campaigns to harass transgender academics, and recently helped to create an article on the BBC that pushed a deliberately misleading study that tried to imply that all trans women are rapists, and which also, in its initial form, platformed a lesbian cisgender woman who had admitted to sexually abusing several women and who later called for the genocide of all trans women. Also, prominent TERF leaders and groups have platformed and worked alongside alt-right groups, as well as TERFs successfully campaigning to remove LGBTQ workplace protection guidelines from places like the BBC created by LGBT rights groups organizations like Stonewall, as well as TERFs harassing Black Lives Matter protesters and spreading anti-Semitic conspiracy theories online. That's again a short list, and I go more into that in those aforementioned videos, as well as some other videos that I'll link down below if you're curious about some of those specific incidents. So for all those reasons, protesting outside of the home of JK Rowling, a woman who has consistently used her platform to support and extol gender-critical folks and ideology, is entirely warranted. People protest outside folks' homes all the time, like how folks protested outside of Ted Cruz's home last year after he abandoned his state to take his family on a tropical vacation while people froze to death during Texas's power failure. Now, I get it, there's a difference between politicians and a writer, but people also protest outside of artists' homes as well. And I do believe that if you're a famous person with a huge platform that you're using to support hate groups, protesting is warranted. However, that being said, harassment is not, and doxing is a form of harassment. Doxing is bad, no matter how famous someone is, and how much the address is known. 100% I agree. So that still leads us to these trans activists posting JK Rowling's address online. But one would expect that if JK Rowling understandably took issue with these trans women posting her address online to the point where she contacted the police, she would do that whenever anyone did that, right? Anyways, here's a photo of a Harry Potter fan posting a very similar picture of her home address back in 2016. And here's another one. And here's another one. None of these folks faced retaliation from JK. So, why is that the case? The only difference I can see between these two situations is one group are fans of JK Rowling, and the other are trans people. But JK Rowling never said, please don't post photos of my home address online for those people, but with trans people, she goes out of her way to contact the police. And see, this is part of what angers me so much. It's one thing to be consistent when you're targeting trans folks. I would still take issue with JK Rowling and her transphobia and platforming of hate groups. But what angers me most is the clear double standard being placed here. Because JK Rowling only gets upset at these situations and actively targets these people when they're trans. This type of double standard is constantly placed upon trans people in all arenas, not just things like this one. For example, take how many bills that have been introduced both last year and this year trying to outlaw the use of puberty blockers for trans children often explicitly state that those same drugs are perfectly acceptable for treatment of non-trans kids. How come it's considered perfectly safe when non-trans kids use these drugs, but when trans kids use them, it's suddenly causing harmful, irreversible damages that we must be so worried about the children for? Again, it's solely and completely because they're trans. And it's just clearly placing a double standard upon the trans community. And that is what JK Rowling is doing here in order to expressly use her platform to complain about trans people. Trans people who are rightfully calling her out on her transphobic BS. Even further, given that JK Rowling has never taken issue with people taking photos outside of her home before, at least not publicly, I would honestly not be surprised if these trans activists were not actively trying to dox JK Rowling and show her address maliciously, but just taking a photo documenting that they were protesting and were indeed outside of her home instead of on some random street corner God knows where. And doing so without any real thought to JK Rowling's address being disseminated by the photo because, again, it was publicly known and she's never had an issue with it before. This, again, is not to say that doxing is okay no matter how famous someone is, but I don't think that that was their intent, especially given the context in which J.K. Rowling's home has been used before. Yet J.K. Rowling apparently thought that this time was such a big deal that she needed to contact the police. Honestly, it just comes across as a very clear attempt by her to vilify not only these transgender activists specifically, stating in her tweets that they, quote, carefully positioned themselves in the photo like it was a carefully planned photo op, but also to vilify the entire trans community. Because you see, her Twitter statement that I was quoting from before went on to say this. Over the last few years, I've watched appalled as women like Allison Bailey, Rachel Sanchez, Marion Miller, Rosie Dunfield, Joanna Cherry, Julie Bindel, Rosa Friedman, Kathleen Stock, and many, many others, including women who have no public profile, but who've contacted me to relate their experiences, have been subject to campaigns of intimidation which range from being hounded on social media, the targeting of their employers, all the way up to doxing and direct threats of violence, including rape. None of these women are protected in the way I am. They and their families have been put into a state of fear and distress for no other reason than they refuse to uncritically accept that the socio-political concept of gender identity should replace that of sex. I have to assume that at I am Georgia Frost, at Hollywood W Stars, and at Richard Energy thought doxing me would intimidate me out of speaking for women's sex-based rights. They should have reflected on the fact that I've now received so many death threats that I could paper the house with them and I haven't stopped speaking out. Perhaps, and I'm just throwing this out there, the best way to prove your movement isn't a threat to women is to stop stalking, harassing, and threatening us. Okay, spicy. I can feel the spice coming off of that statement. So in her statement, JK Rowling brings up that she, as well as several other women, all of whom are gender-critical feminists, have been harassed, threatened, and doxed by the, quote, transgender community. Now, I have zero doubt that that is absolutely true. That there have been transgender people and some of our allies that have sent death threats and harassment and doxing to JK Rowling and these other people. That there have been harassment campaigns leveled against her. While I may understand why many of these trans people and our allies do so, for the reasons that I stated above about the harm that gender-critical feminists cause, I wish to say here, and I have always said this when talking about JK Rowling, that this harassment is absolutely wrong. While I do believe that things like public shaming and protesting of JK Rowling, as well as doing other things like constantly mentioning and bringing up the harm that she has caused trans people whenever Harry Potter gets mentioned in public discourse, is not only acceptable but necessary and important, I don't believe that things like death threats and active harassment meant to harm her mental health and make her and her family feel scared is remotely acceptable. It's wrong and it's shameful to anyone who gets it. Yet, here's the thing with that. Rowling mentions these things in order to play the victim here, because yes, while it's true that she does get these death threats and it is undeniably wrong, she makes it seem as if she, and only she, and other gender-critical feminists are the only ones who suffer from this type of harassment online. But trans people also get this same type of harassment all the time. For example, as I've shown in many different videos, numerous studies show that trans people are consistently the most harassed, bullied, and targeted group in online spaces, with very little recourse for many trans people in order to protest it, because most platforms like Twitter or YouTube won't even recognize that transphobia is worth blocking or stopping people from posting online about. For example, one study found that on platforms like YouTube, this platform that you're watching this video on, 78% of comments that mention trans people are actively abusive. Numerous other studies have found that trans and non-binary folks are also more likely to be the victims of harassment and bullying, not to mention violence, both online and in person, just for the simple fact of being transgender online or publicly. There are literal entire sites that were created and still exist with the express purpose of harassing and attacking trans people. There are sites with whole forums with the explicit purpose of doxing trans people and insulting us. I myself, as I've said before, have been doxed and targeted for being a public trans person. I know of several sites where people watch my reviews of TV shows and things like that just to insult my looks, insult how I enjoy certain television shows, just because I'm a trans person. Even further, I've had folks attempt to harass me at my home during things like live streams or through the mail. I know there are websites with forums doxing and harassing me and other trans creators that I'm honestly just afraid to even explicitly name for fear of inciting them to attack me more. Hell, even this oblong reference will probably get them all hot and bothered, so great. So for Rowling to frame only her and gender-critical feminists as the ones receiving abuse, without recognition that trans people often face exactly the same and often more, is at my most generous, just ignorant of her. But considering how much she's stated in the past she's researched trans people, I'm not willing to be so generous here anymore. And I will say that it's probably just her being actively misinformative and using her harassment in order to humanize herself and gender-critical feminists while simultaneously vilifying all trans people. Even further, TERFs try to use active misinformation to further vilify trans people, with many TERFs after this incident claiming ridiculous things online like, oh, JK Rowling's address wasn't posted online, these trans people were just actually doxing her. They were the first people ever to post JK Rowling's address online. In order to push that the narrative this was a truly unique form of doxing by these trans women in order to not only vilify them, but the entire trans community.
Additionally, many TERFs online tried to share this photo of one of the trans activists to claim that she was violent in trying to hurt JK Rowling, when really, if you look at the full context of the photo, you find out that it was actually just the trans activist protesting at the spot where he received his own death threats and harassment himself for being gay.
And we see that this vilification works. I mean, JK Rowling literally ends her tweets by saying, if your movement requires harassing people, then maybe it's wrong. Which is a statement that I find incredibly ironic, because these two situations of harassment are not the same. While I do think that the harassment that JK Rowling faces is wrong, as well as the harassment that many gender-critical feminists face is wrong, the reason that she and others get it is because she holds gender-critical views and supports gender-critical feminists, which again are a dogmatic hate group for all the reasons that I've outlined above. Even further, in JK Rowling's statements on these trans activists doxing her, she platforms several gender-critical feminists who, ironically, are doxers themselves. Marion Miller and Rosie Dunfield are both gender-critical feminists that have doxed trans people publicly. Rosa Freeman, for example, also posted a trans person's email publicly and got her audience to try to harass her. Julie Bindel posted someone's phone number to Twitter and told her followers to harass them just days before the JK Rowling incident. Even further, gender-critical feminists often target harassment campaigns against trans people. It's one of their favorite tactics. Want a further example of that other than the ones I just posted on screen? Then look no further than the fact that JK Rowling tagged the profiles of the trans women who protested her in her statement, leading to all three of them receiving so much harassment themselves that they were forced to delete their Twitters and social media. So I find it, honestly, the height of hypocrisy for JK Rowling to decry being doxed and harassed online while simultaneously promoting folks who engage in that same type of behavior that she's condemning and inciting her own audience to do the same to three trans people. At any point, she could turn her back on those views, renounce them, and yet she doesn't. And that is why she receives harassment. I'm not saying it's okay, but that's why. Trans people cannot do the same. Trans people get harassment just for being trans, and we can't stop being trans. We don't have that luxury that JK Rowling does. The only way we could possibly do that is if we detransition or go back into the closet. Both harmful events to trans people that can affect our mental health just as much, if not more so, than us receiving public harassment. So you see, after all of this, why I'm pretty pissed off. And I'm not someone who gets pissed off pretty easily. I don't usually get angry. It's not an emotion that I'm very comfortable with or used to. But I hope my explanation here at least points to why. To finish out, as I stated earlier, I don't discuss this story simply to attack JK Rowling or to illustrate JK Rowling's hypocrisy in a single incident, but because it's a heightened, singular example that highlights the more everyday truth. That while harassment is sadly ubiquitous online, and all groups and all people get it in some way, shape, or form often, and it is wrong that folks like JK Rowling get it, and I truly wish that I could stop them get it. I truly do. If I could stop JK Rowling and other gender-critical feminists getting harassment, I would stop it in an instant. But that harassment is neither exclusive to them, nor does it come out of nowhere, given the harm that she and TERFs like her have caused. And even further, it scares me how much the harm that she has caused to the trans community is often either ignored or not understood by the general public. I mean, I was traveling just a few weeks ago for Thanksgiving to see some family, and I stepped into an airport bookstore while I was traveling and was instantaneously surrounded by dozens of signs promoting JK Rowling's newest Christmas Pig book. Instantly, I realized how little some places seem to care about trans issues in the face of someone who makes them a bunch of money. And JK Rowling is still making tons of money. Still getting tons of promotion, still able to publish books, still able to continually have Harry Potter movies get made and video games get made, no matter how crappy they are. Yet gender-critical feminists who, like JK Rowling, get platformed all the time on places like the BBC, love to weaponize their stories of harassment to vilify the trans community about how their voices are being silenced in order to justify their further attack on both our rights and our mental health, with even more weaponized harassment. Harassment that we trans people sadly are already even more vulnerable to. It basically comes down to this. JK Rowling gets harassed and everyone freaks out because no one expects JK Rowling to get harassment. But when dozens, hundreds, thousands of trans people get harassment every single day, no one says a damn thing. Because that is sadly expected. So, with all that being said, I did say that I had a little bit of a transgender in making this video. You see, I wanted to get this video out earlier considering that this incident happened about 2 weeks ago, but unfortunately I didn't have the time. And that's because I've actually been hard at work on a video that I think may be one of my personal best videos that I've ever made. And I'm actually very excited about it. It is coming out next week. This video is a literal movie. It's 2 hours long, but trust me, it is absolutely worth the watch because it delves into the history of sex on Star Trek, and specifically the horny, sexy vision of one Gene Roddenberry, the man who decided to boldly go where no one had gone before, if you know what I mean. But seriously, I'm honestly deeply proud of this video. I think it might be one of my best works. I worked really hard in terms of both research, visuals, production, humor, editing, and everything else. And I honestly think that it is a video that is talking about some stuff that I think that not only the Star Trek community, but the sort of fandom nerd community never really talks about all that much. And I think will be fairly revelatory in terms of the direction of the story of not only Star Trek, but the story of Gene Roddenberry goes. Because trust me, there are some things that most people fail to talk about when it comes to Gene Roddenberry and sex in Star Trek and sex in science fiction in general. The reason I'm actually making this video, and I say this without any sort of joke or irony, is because I think talking about sex in science fiction, and Star Trek in particular, gets to the core of what science fiction and Star Trek is all about. A show about the positive future for humanity, about finding connections with others and taking delight in the diversity of other beings, and how sometimes we can fail in those goals. And in that way, I am very excited about that video. And so I decided to make this video on JK Rowling now, even though it's a little bit late, because in all honesty, my Star Trek videos have been kind of floundering in the algorithm lately. And I think that's in part because the algorithm doesn't really surface my Trek videos to those who watch them, but instead likes to surface my videos on transgender topics because those videos have done really, really well. And while I do take some satisfaction in making videos on trans issues and transphobia and things like that, and I do think that is very important and something I will continue to do, I am upset that I constantly get pigeonholed as a trans creator only getting to talk about trans issues. So I just wanted to use this opportunity to promote a video that I'm very, very proud of, that I'm scared won't do well in the algorithm, and I just wanted to hope that all of you will take the chance to watch that video, even if you have, just a little bit of time to watch part of it next week. So I just wanted to promote that a little bit. And don't worry, the video is made to be accessible to non-Star Trek fans as well. So please, if you can, come join me for the video premiere next Friday, December 17th at 10 a.m. Pacific time, or you can find the video on my channel anytime after that. And if you don't see it pop up in your feed, please know that it will be up after next Friday. So please just go and look for it and search for it in my channel. And so with that all said, to wrap up this video, I just want to say thank you so much for listening. I hope this was educational. Again, this wasn't meant to attack JK Rowling, but try to educate about this issue despite my clear anger and frustration with the entire incident. But at the end of the day, I just hope that you are all doing well, and I hope that you are taking care of yourself as we wind out 2021, and I will see you next week, and I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper.
Sadly, due to a footage problem, there's no patron wrap this week, but I promise that I'll make the next one for the Sex and Star Trek video extra special for y'all. So apologies to my patrons, I love you, and I promise I'll make it up to you soon.